about how the book was making its way towards bookshelves. It goes back and discusses the beginning when basically book one wasn't even totally finished yet. In the small pot of adults in which Harry Potter found his first and most influential fan base, Rosamund de la Haye gets the role of cheerleader. Everyone involved at the time now remembers her fervor for the book and the way she helped gear up Bloomsbury to think of Harry as special and treat it as such. If the best thing that can happen to a book before it's published is for the publishers themselves to be excited about it, then Rosamund can be thanked for running the first ever Harry Potter marketing campaign. She had just gotten a job in marketing at Bloomsbury when Barry handed her a manuscript and told her it was a bit special. She'd soon regard that as an understatement. She read it overnight and fell head over heels, calling it the funniest thing she'd ever read, and she found herself pinning people to walls at dinner parties and telling them about it. She knew that it would be a better book outside the publishing house if it had fans within it, but that's not the entire reason she and Barry's assistant rolled up the book's first 50 pages like a scroll and stuffed it with Smarties candies and distributed them to everyone upon whose head the decision to purchase the book lay. Nor was it entirely because they felt it was worthy of the much-desired Smarties prize. The children's list was under 2 years old at the company and hadn't established itself in sales terms, so each acquisition became a challenge. It was a gimmick, one that made the pages look like an academic scroll with a treat inside, and whether or not the people to whom the scroll was left had read it, they remembered that it was the manuscript that had literally been tarted up. You guys really enjoying that. It was crap, wasn't it? We had to really fight to make ourselves heard, but that's quite characteristic of children's list publishers. You have to jump up and down and shout and scream, Rosamund explained. Barry received Bloomsbury's blessing to proceed, and the next day, negotiations with the Christopher Little agency took all of 5 minutes. Barry paid what he remembers to be £2,000 for the British rights, though the first offer was £1,000 for global. At the same time, HarperCollins had come back to the table and had wanted to see the full manuscript, though they were hedging and hesitant. Chris called Jo Rowling, who was still just Joanne then, and asked which publisher she preferred. She had to stop him to figure out what he was actually saying. I said to him, "Are you saying that the book is definitely going to be published?" I had to really get that clear. I needed him to say, "Your book will be published." And he said, "Yes, yes, yes." And she said, imitating Christopher's duh tone of voice. And then I screamed. "So we took the second worst offer in history," Christopher said, joking. Though Jo would have sold everything to Bloomsbury for 50 pence, Christopher held on to her world rights, advising her to beg, steal, and borrow, do whatever she had to do in order to survive, while he, her agent, played a more cool hand in securing the best international deal he could. Soon afterwards, Jo Rowling, Christopher, and Barry Cunningham finally met at a restaurant outside Hamleys in London. They had to describe themselves to each other beforehand, as though on a blind date. It was a celebratory lunch as much as a first meeting, but both men warned the author not to get ahead of herself, not to quit a day job or think that there would be a lot of money coming. No big money ever really came from children's books, after all. Some successful children's authors still only made a few £1,000s a year. Jo Rowling said that Barry was the only one who told her he thought it would do well. It was the first person to tell her to. A few small things had to be changed about the book. It needed slimming for a start. She had written the book out on a typewriter because she couldn't afford a computer, so little mistakes recurred. She spelled apothecary wrong throughout and still looks embarrassed mentioning it. Yet every change or suggested change felt like a terrible travesty, she said, because I had slaved so hard on it. "All first authors are nervous," said Barry. "You're like their first boyfriend. It's a very delicate relationship. I don't think we've ever had a situation where I was trying to push her into something that wasn't reasonable." There was no email because Jo Rowling still didn't have a computer. They would leave each other phone messages when they had something to say, and sometimes things got a little lost in translation. Once Barry left a message with some questions about Quidditch, and Jo called him upset and in real nervousness, worried he wanted to cut it altogether. Most edits were small. Jo Rowling doesn't remember shaving much, but she does remember fighting for two things and winning: her title, and to keep a seminal scene in which Harry, Ron, and Hermione become friends by knocking out a 12-foot mountain troll. "My self-esteem generally at this time in my life was rock bottom," she said. "No one could have felt they were a failure more than I, but there was one area of my life where I had, was it confidence? Yes, it was. And it felt brave to argue with Barry because he was giving me my life's ambition and I desperately, desperately wanted to please him." She was intent to show that something huge had to happen between Ron and Hermione to make that first connection, and had the same sure-mindedness about her plot and characters that later became so characteristic of her public persona. "Do you have a boy like Ron just come around to her qualities? It's just not going to happen. And unless she's an extremist, she's not going to reveal her good qualities because they're both 11. And you need something like that when you're 11. So I really argued to keep it. The scene remained and has become one of the most treasured of the first book, especially for the line, "There are some things you can't share without ending up liking each other, and knocking out a 12-foot mountain troll is one of them." Barry would leave Bloomsbury to open his own publishing house before Harry Potter saw a shelf, but things were already moving swiftly without him. Rosamund and others at Bloomsbury, including the book's new editor, Emma Matthewson, asked that the author change her published name to her first two initials instead of Joanne, so that she didn't turn off potential boy readers with her femaleness. No middle name, no problem. She took the name Kathleen for her grandmother, and the transformation to J.K. Rowling became complete. The first Harry Potter was ready. Harry Potter may have struggled to break into the real world, but it wasn't without its blessing's importance. Maybe there was some benign force leading Joanne Rowling to bring her book to the exact right people at the exact right moment. No one involved in any step of the process admits to knowing or being able to guess that Harry Potter wasn't exactly just another book. Yet the fact of its publication at all, this long, non-politically correct, weirdly titled book about magic, proves that wrong. And it certainly wasn't just another book to J.K. Rowling, who finished it around the beginning of August 1995, lying on her stomach in her dingy apartment in Leith while her daughter slept. She wrote by hand and had finally scrawled the end at the bottom of her page. Even today, she reenacts the moment like it's been perfectly preserved in her mind, eyes racing back and forth over the final words of the full manuscript, hair almost a closed curtain around her face, hands frozen midair as though any movement would sweep it all away. I've finished it. I've finished my novel, she thought. She rose and drew back the curtains to discover that night had fallen while she had been writing. And just like the opening chapter of her first book, the opening chapter of a series that would soon become a phenomenon, an opening chapter that would mirror itself in the world in which everyone was talking about Harry Potter, the boy who lived, she found the tabby cat sitting on the brick garden wall, staring back at her.
Aww.
"Good night, Professor McGonagall," she said.